to get to know Gabriella over the past weeks. She's a James Beard Award-nominated food journalist, and she's based in New York. She's been the editor at Savoir Magazine, Rachel Ray Every Day, Time Out New York, and a contributor to the Wall Street Journal. And without further ado, I'm going to hand the program over to Gabriella.
Thank you so much, Lynn. It is just such an honor to be part of this programming and to help with the initiative of the Vilna Shul, and it's just an honor to do our part to continue the legacy of Lithuanian Jews and their cultural and delicious culinary contributions. So thank you so much. I just wanted to check in with the audience. I got an alert on my computer that my Zoom is not working. Can you hear me? Because if not, I will take a pause and restart, and then we can start this back up again.
Yes, we can hear you just fine, Gabriella.
So it sounds like you can hear me. Fantastic. So I will continue just welcoming you all. And you could have been doing a lot of things today, but you're here with us, and we're so grateful for that. So let's introduce the other panelists. This is a conversation on Lithuanian Jewish food and the culinary heritage of the Lithuanian Jews. And we have two people who are uniquely qualified to discuss this topic with us. First, there is Nida Degutiene. She is a Lithuanian who lived in Israel for several years, and her husband was the ambassador to Israel from Lithuania, and she developed a really interesting perspective on the whole melting pot of Jewish food. But also, she spent some time in South Africa as well when her husband was an ambassador there. And it turns out that there is an enormous Lithuanian Jewish population in South Africa that migrated there at the turn of the 20th century, rather in the late 19th century, if I remember correctly. So she has a lot of wonderful stories to share with us. And not least of all, she also wrote a cookbook called The Taste of Israel, in which she explored all kinds of cuisines that have contributed to that country's heritage, including Lithuanian Jewish cuisine. And Jeffrey Yoskowitz, the author of the Gefilte Manifesto, he's made a really unique name for himself as an Ashkenazi Jewish food expert. And he leads a culinary heritage tour that on the moment is on pause, but it will resume. And that takes people like us who are so curious about where we came from and what we used to eat through Eastern Europe to rediscover those roots that we have. Why do we eat the foods that we eat today when we don't live in Eastern Europe, but a lot of the food on our holiday tables is really straight out of those countries. And Jeffrey is going to help shed some light for us today on that, and specifically in terms of how Lithuanian Jewish food finds its way on the table, what it looks like. So let's just welcome, a little virtual applause for Nida and Jeffrey. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. So happy to be here. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Really a pleasure.
Good afternoon to everyone, and Shavua Tov to all New Yorkers who just started the new week. So I'm very, very happy and privileged to be here with you.
So it looks like you can hear me, but I can't hear you. So I am going to leave the talk and come back, and Lynn, I'm sure you can play some nice intermission music while I do that. Just give me 1 second to figure out my technical difficulties, and maybe Nida and Jeffrey in the meantime can show you the foods that they made today, and I hopefully will be back and hearing very shortly. So
Gabby, don't worry, Nida and I, we
right
can
back.
talk about Lithuanian food for a long time. So she's gonna sign off. Okay, so Nida, we're here, we're waiting for Gabby, we're gonna have a talk, but one of the things that we decided to do was we were gonna cook some dishes that were gonna be representative of Lithuanian Jewish cuisine, that we're gonna tell a story, a little bit of a show and tell. And so maybe you wanna start us off, maybe just show us either one dish or your spread, and we can go from there. But I'm really curious to see what you cooked up, because I know we wanted to surprise each other a bit.
Look, Jeffrey, if you could also smell what I'm smelling, because the food is exactly where my nose is, and I would love everyone would smell what I smell. But let me show you very, very slowly what I've got. those are my dishes, and plus I will, of course, have another dish, which is not a dish, rather ingredient, because I think ingredient looks much better than the dish itself.
Okay.
And you, Jeffrey, how about you?
Well, I see that Gabby's back, so maybe we'll hold off and there'll be a little bit of added suspense for everyone. But I'm so glad actually to see, and I'm curious what that extra ingredient is later. And I want to dig into that borscht as well. But Gabby, can you hear us?
I can hear you, and I can't smell though. So that's a technical difficulty we're going to have to fix one day. But Nida, you showed us the foods that you made for the day.
Yes, and but we are still waiting until Jeffrey will show us his.
Okay, so Jeffrey wants to be coy. So why don't we talk a little bit about the dishes that you selected and why you selected them?
Me, it's the question, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was thinking quite, it took some time for me to decide which dishes I would like to show, but I decided to go with very, very typical Lithuanian dishes, which were the biggest surprise for me to learn that those dishes actually are also Jewish dishes. To me, it took really time to digest it and to take this idea as as usual. So first of all, again, will perhaps show you my dishes. First of all, the blintzes, which you see here. To be honest, I grew on those blintzes, and many Lithuanian children grew on those blintzes, because I would refuse to go to school if my mother wouldn't make blintzes every single morning for 12 years. For 12 years, every single day. So imagine after this time, someone tells me that this is actually maybe not necessarily a Lithuanian dish. To me, that was a little bit of a surprise. So that's my favorite. That's the favorite of my daughter, and I think of every single Lithuanian child, and not child because I love it even until now. Another dish which I prepared is cold borscht. We usually put this hard-boiled egg inside the borscht, and we eat it with hot boiled or fried potatoes. Again, this dish is very much, I would say, Lithuanian. At least Lithuanians think so. But when I went to South Africa, I actually, let me take my screen back to its place. When I went to South Africa and I was given the cold borscht in South Africa, I understood that, when Jewish people, when they emigrated 100 years ago from Lithuania to South Africa, they brought a lot of Lithuanian traditions, a lot of culinary traditions there. And when I saw this cold borscht, I nearly, pulled out of my chair, because I said, how comes this pink soup, which is called pink soup by all the people who are coming and visiting Lithuania, and they see usually this soup, they are not brave enough even to try it. I mean, foreigners. But when they try it, they nicely say, well, it's okay, it's a strange soup, strange color, and usually they do not ask for another try. And how comes that you guys are making this soup? And this is how I realized that this is yet another dish which we share in common. And I think Litvak, how you can recognize Litvak if he knows what the pink soup is, this is Litvak 100%. And the third dish, although it's not a dish and the ingredient is actually, let me show you, this is a herring.
Wow, is that a real herring?
Herring.
I think most Americans haven't seen a whole herring before.
Oh yeah, the whole herring. And actually, you know what? Actually, I think herring is the ingredient which has been brought to Lithuania by Jews, and it sticks to our lives, it sticks to ourselves. And we have one day per year, it's a Christmas Eve, where on our tables, there have to be 12 dishes without meat. So out of these 12 dishes, at least 10 dishes are made with herring. Imagine how experienced we are in preparing herring. And I think we can thank our Jewish brothers and sisters who actually were famous for trading herring. And since I cannot find in the shops the herring salted the old-fashioned way, I managed to get a fresh frozen herring from Norway, exactly the same way how Jewish people used to do hundreds of years ago, and I sold it myself. So I'm preparing for Christmas because there might be a lockdown. So I want to make sure that I will have herring on my table for Christmas Eve for sure, and for a few more weeks.
I think the herring hoarding makes you a very legitimate panelist for this conversation.
Oh.
This is something I've never heard, and I applaud you. Now, I'd love to explore this topic of, I thought that food was Lithuanian, and then I met this Jewish community that lives in another country who basically were like a time capsule for Lithuanian Jews of a certain era. They moved to South Africa, and then the cuisine sort of progressed from there. Maybe Jeffrey, I know you have a really great perspective in general on just the Eastern European Jewish food in the whole context of the Jewish diaspora. Do you have any thoughts on how Lithuanian Jewish food might be different from Lithuanian food? How does one make that distinction?
Yeah, it's a great question. I can tell you, having spent many years researching quote unquote Ashkenazi Jewish food of the Jews of Eastern and Central Europe, and having traveled around the world and traveled around that region, like where you draw those lines and the definitions are really complicated. Right? I mean, even if you want to talk about food of Vilnius up until you know, at one point was part of the Russian Empire, at one point was part of Poland, was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was under Soviet influence, you know, in the interwar period, Vilna was part of Poland. So where does it even fit with the story of Lithuania, right? So the, Vilna being the capital, what was once called the Jerusalem of the North by Napoleon, right? This important center of Jewish life was at times not even Lithuanian, and yet the most important Lithuanian center. So this question is really hard, and often there are stories like Nida said, right? There was the Jews were the herring merchants and the traders, and of course herring, you know, there's herring in the Baltic, and herring's a part of all of Baltic life, and Jews helped popularize it or spread it. For me, what makes when I think a lot about some of these differences between different parts of the Eastern European Jewish world, you know, the famous example is the story of gefilte fish, right? What makes gefilte fish different in Lithuania versus in Poland, or parts of Poland and parts of Lithuania? It's how sweet the gefilte fish is. This is the very famous gefilte fish line. Nida, I see you're nodding. You know what I'm talking about. This is the story many of you have heard, that you know, in Poland, the gefilte fish was sweeter. Why? Well, the story goes, there was sugar beet production took place in areas. Sugar was plentiful in parts of Poland. The Hasidic Jews, the Hasidic movement, as they danced and spread and brought their joyful version of Judaism, of spiritual Judaism, to different parts of Eastern Europe, they literally gave out sugar to make the connection between the sweetness of religious life and the sweetness of the foods. Of course, in Lithuania, in Vilna, very famously, Vilna was the center of the what are known as the Misnagdim, the ones who rejected Hasidut. They rejected this particular kind of spiritual Judaism, and they were serious, they were studious, and the Vilna of Gaon being the famous leader of this particular intellectual religious movement. And then it's fitting that the gefilte fish in Lithuania didn't have any sweetness. It was known for being peppery and having a savory quality to it. It was, and I think it's a really good example. It also, we can complicate it with history and nuance and talk about that there were, Hasidic Jews that also lived in Lithuania. There were also, of course, there was a really interesting, intellectual, modern Haskalah movement also in Lithuania. But you can see, you can also see at various different points in Lithuania, the Jews were known for being some of the more impoverished Jews of the larger Eastern European region. And foods like Nida mentioned herring. Herring, it is a cheaper fish that's available. It's cheaper than freshwater fish. It preserves. And then foods like gefilte fish, when you chop up your fish and you add in all these fillers, you're literally you're diluting the freshness of the fish and the quality of it, and you're adding more in. And one of the dishes that I brought, which Nida, I know you didn't make, but you just have the whole herring. But I made a very classic Lithuanian, a Litvak chopped herring salad, which essentially is like, I can show it now, I can show it later, Gabby. You're the moderator.
I think that you've made us wait long enough. It's time to show us the herring salad.
I'll show you. This is the chopped herring salad here. I'll show you some of the other things later. And this is, in some ways, like the filling. This is known in Yiddish as Vorschmack. It's like the before meal. And of course, you have a very, very religious, very pious Jewish community. And herring was one of those foods that was neither milk nor meat, neither milchig nor fleischig. So when you had a guest coming over and you didn't know if they had previously eaten meat or not, what are you going to serve them? You would serve them herring. You'd put herring and some rye bread. So that's a classic dish. I made another dish, which is a very classic Litvak dessert that I first tasted myself, not in South Africa, but actually in Zimbabwe, Nida, where I met the Lithuanian community there. And this is a carrot-like fruit dessert. And it's called ingberlach. Ingber in Yiddish is ginger, and when it's made with ginger, that it's called that. I've only tasted it made with carrots. Gabby, when I talked to you about this dish, you actually said to me, and you can just see it. This is this carrot gel.
It looks so good.
It's often made with a lot of citrus as well, so it has a really, really wonderful flavor. When I first tasted this, this is a Passover treat, okay? I tasted this and it reminded me so much of those fruit gels you get for Passover in the kosher aisle of the supermarket in the United States. These fake citrus-looking gels. Yeah. It was the exact same flavor. I can't tell you like how strange and peculiar it was to taste what was a very processed product, traces of it in this kind of homemade natural candy. And but for the most part, Lithuanian Jewish food is just like Polish Jewish food. It's just like Hungarian Jewish food. It's a lot of pickled and preserved things. I brought a bunch of pickled things here, and you can see this is these are mini baby cucumbers, pickled tomatoes, and this is a pickled Brussels sprout, actually Brussels sprouts and cabbage, and these naturally fermented pickles. But of course, like everything, there's regional differences. And one of the things I loved about traveling in Lithuania was tasting sauerkraut with different flavors. And my favorite was cranberry, or these, they're not quite the American cranberries, but they're referred to as cranberries in Lithuania. And it gives it a little bit of a tart, a bite to it, in addition to already the lactic acid of the fermented sauerkraut. And so you're going to see your classic rye breads and all of that. And I'll show you my last dish that I brought. I just want to mention that, like Lithuania, just like Poland, just like all these other places, Russia, if you live there, whether you're Jewish or not, you are connected to the land. Even if you lived in the city, you go outside of the city, you'll go and forage for mushrooms in the late summer, in the fall. You'll be connected, in the spring, when horseradish grows wild in the hills, you'll go and harvest that as well. And that's, of course, why we have it for Passover with our gefilte fish. There's other reasons too. But I brought a dish called schwemmlach. What a name, schwemmlach. And this is basically a chanterelle mushroom soup. And I had plenty of mushroom soups, famously, krupnik, which is one of the dishes of Poland, which is basically a barley and mushroom. We would know it as mushroom and barley here in the United States. But this, and I'll just show you my spread while I'm talking. This is schwemmlach. I tasted when I went to Lithuania. It's just beautiful. It's got these beautiful, just these orange colors, and then there's like a little bit of an orange hue with the chanterelles. This is a soup that I first tasted when I was in Lithuania, and I cooked with a member of the Lithuanian-Jewish community. And this was the dish she grew up outside of the city, in the country, and this was the dish that told her story of Lithuanian Jewish life before the war. And it was really beautiful to get to cook it with her. And it also kind of shows the role that dairy plays. And actually, Lithuanian Jews ate the least amount of dairy actually of the Eastern European Jews, because dairy was considered synonymous with affluence and abundance, and especially in the interwar years, the Jewish community struggled. And a couple just little treats. I'll share the treats later. I'll share the treats.
Okay, you'll make us wait for it. Well, this is fascinating. I mean, I love seeing your chanterelle soup because, to be honest, when you showed that plate, it looked like something that would be very fashionable today, with how new Nordic cuisine has really influenced the way chefs everywhere are cooking, and these Baltic ingredients have become very exotic. The idea of foraging has become very exotic. But let's talk a little more about just the Baltics and the cuisine that the region offers, because people do, like you were mentioning, Jeffrey, they talk about Eastern European Jewish cuisine as sort of a catch-all, but we have Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And I think that there are different culinary traditions that come from these places. And Nida, I mean, you are a Lithuanian cookbook author. I'd be really interested to hear how your fellow non-Jewish Lithuanians received your information that you were sharing about the dishes that you've all known your whole life. What was that like, telling people like you who had not realized there was a shared heritage of some of your most beloved Lithuanian dishes with, like you said, your Lithuanian Jewish brothers and sisters?
You know what, I thought at least, my first encounter with Lithuanian Jewish food was basically about 12 years ago in Israel. I went to Israel with the idea that I have no idea about Jewish food whatsoever. At that point, I didn't know how related those two cuisines are. And when I was invited to one of the first evenings, when I was invited by some of our local friends in Israel, and I saw the Shabbat table full of Lithuanian dishes, I seriously thought that those people just made extra mile, and I don't know how, but they got amazing those recipes, and they wanted to please us, because maybe they thought that in 3 days we already are missing our food. So I was sure that they were trying to make us happy and cooked Lithuanian dishes. And I said, well, it's so nice of you. I'm really so glad that you guys made those all our Lithuanian dishes. And those guys are staring at me and they're saying, no, it's not Lithuanian. This is actually our Jewish food. This is what we usually eat on Shabbat. And then I was like, no, it's impossible, because, this is the dish which we are given when we go to the kindergarten. This is, my staple, I don't know, every Thursday dish, because, I'm getting it at school. And all these dishes appear to be very much Lithuanian. So then I started digging in. And since at that time I started blogging about, I just started sharing my experience in Israel, through the culinary, I would say, lens. I was telling all these stories, to my audience. At that time, I didn't know who that audience was. And then it was another surprise when I started receiving emails from people whom I basically didn't know. Those were not my friends, not some of my contacts. And they were, they were asking for a very specific recipes. And they used to write me, like, oh my goodness, you are in Israel. Most probably you can get that recipe, which I remember from my childhood. I had that friend. We went together with her to school, and then later she emigrated to Israel, and I lost all contact with her. But I still remember from those times how her mother used to cook, these cookies or these dishes. Maybe you can somehow get this recipe, because this is something I want to learn. I want to cook. I want to remember those days. And this is how I figured out that it's very much something which is missing, to ourselves, because there were times when Jewish community was about 55% of Lithuania. I mean, more than half of people in Lithuania were Jews. So imagine how interrelated life was between Lithuanian community and Jewish community. Obviously, they were tasting each other's food. Obviously, these traditions mixed, over those years. And many people were growing up on those dishes, and suddenly, they lost something. They lost something. They didn't have, a chance to have it. So this was yet another encouragement for me to go and to explore it and to share with my readers. And this is how I ended up writing the book and just putting all these stories, because these are not my recipes. I didn't create them. I just gathered the stories brought, from the Jewish houses. Usually those houses have been in Lithuania 100 years ago. Now these houses are in Israel, in South Africa. And I just shared these stories through the recipes in the book, which to my biggest surprise became very popular in Lithuania, and it was sold out fully, and for maybe 6 months it was number one in top 3 best-selling books. So that's how I understood how we Lithuanians want to fill the gap, with this Jewish food. In some cases, we just learned that these dishes, which are so dear to us, are also Jewish dishes. So perhaps this is why we love them so much. But as I say, there were a lot of pleasant surprises for me, and I'm sure for many Lithuanians as well.
Yes, and you definitely restored something like a connection that was missing when you made that discovery in Israel. But there also must be an immense sense of loss, because food comes from people. And, the food didn't just disappear, it was the people. And I imagine that with this embracing of the food again comes a conversation about why the food is no longer there. And I wonder, how do you approach that conversation yourself and with the other people who are in Lithuania enjoying the foods and the nostalgia, but also coming to terms with why it's no longer there?
I think, we had very complicated history in Lithuania. And of course, having 50 years of Soviet occupation and basically rewritten history and not told, we didn't study at school about Holocaust, about that loss of part of our society. This all came to us when we regained our independence 30 years ago. So to many people, it was suddenly, a shock. What happened, and they learned basically the true history only very recently. And it obviously took time to get in terms with all this new information. But I think slowly with opening up, with learning a lot of things, with hearing a lot of stories, and finding out that we share so many things among ourselves, I think it came also a very big sympathy, or I do not know the correct word. It's, we sometimes joke that in Lithuania, Jewishness is very sexy because everyone wants to know more. There's never enough of knowing more about Jewishness. What are the traditions? Why are these traditions? What's happening in Jewish life? I mean, people are very much excited. And since this year is celebrated as 300 years of the birth of Vilna Gaon, entire year is dedicated actually to Jewish culture in Lithuania, and in a very broad sense of that word. And what I love very much, that on the national TV channel, they have just started specific programs, like a series of programs from very small villages about Jewish life, about Jews who lived in those villages, and about, their professions, about their lives later on in New York, where that house was, what did they do, how. And it's a lot of also relationship and culinary, stories and everything. I am stick to the screen when this program is on. I promise you, it's one of my favorite, and I'm sure it's like it's rediscovering our own history through all these small details.
Let us know when the English subtitles come out so we can all watch it.
It should be shown in the world, I guess, because there are so many people from this part of the world now spread in entire globe, from Johannesburg to New York. I'm sure many people would be learning about their ancestors as well.
Maybe now's a good time, Jeffrey, for you to show us your other treat.
Oh, well, I brought a few things. One is I brought a black radish here. and so when Nida, is this evocative or anything for you? Are you appreciating the seeing of black radish? So
yes, it's healthy.
yeah, this is something that I always when I was researching my cookbook, the Gefilte Manifesto, and really kind of digging deeper into Ashkenazi history, I turned to a lot of memoirs and actually novels, Yiddish novels, and one of the recurring themes is just images of people or stories just eating like a radish slathered in schmaltz, usually a black radish. And actually, I had never seen a black radish until I went to Eastern Europe. Now at the farmer's market near me in Brooklyn, there's a whole radish stand. It's amazing. There's all sorts of watermelon radishes, and it's fantastic. And so I was able to find a black radish for today when I went to the market yesterday. But again, that association and connection to the land, but also that's the story of working with less, right? That a snack.
I'm sorry, may I just add to this black radish story, because radish, the regular radish has a very short time when you can harvest it because of seasonality. Lithuania has 4 very, very distinctive seasons, and black radish is only one sort which can grow in basically any weather, and especially it can be grown when the weather is very cold. So that's now exactly the time when the black radish is in season.
Yeah. And I'll say I actually sliced up some radish for myself and with a little bit of butter to eat. But the black radish here is far more bitter than the one I've had in Eastern Europe. So that's one. The other thing I brought was a revelation for me when I traveled to Eastern Europe. And it's not the most, I would say, sexy item, but this is a smoked prune, a smoked plum.
Wow.
And Nida, you're acknowledging what I'm holding up. What? Yeah, of course. What here in the United States, we don't know from smoked plums. It's not something we really grew up with. So, and when I had it and learned that, I saw this actually at the Halas Turgis market in Vilnius, and I tasted it there for the first time. But I also learned that there's a history connected, again, like you said, Nida, a way of, and Gabby, I've actually heard you previously at some point speak about this, the role of Jews as transmitters who are bringing Jewish, maybe they weren't the ones who developed the recipes or these dishes, but they're the ones who brought them elsewhere. So because in parts of Eastern Europe, much of Eastern Europe, Jews were not allowed to own land. There's exceptions to this. In fact, throughout history, Jews did own land, but overall, that's one of the reasons why traditionally Jews went into money lending and other businesses associated with the Jewish community. Often the Jewish community would go into an orchard and rent it out, or some Jewish merchants would go rent it out, and because they couldn't dry their plums to make prunes, that would have been done if they owned the land, they built pits and they actually smoked them to quickly dry them and create the smoked plum that is now in Poland, I know in Lithuania, very commonly eaten, used in desserts. When I bite into it, actually, these are these like kind of Hungarian plums that it tastes just like slivovitz. And when I first ate this, it reminded me that slivovitz, of course, being a plum of, some call it plum firewater. I grew up thinking of it as a plum brandy, and we would drink this only on Passover. Passover slivovitz, it was often called. And whenever I eat this, it literally tastes the slivovitz. It tastes like Passover to me. And so those are the 2 little extra bonus items that I brought that I wanted to share.
I want you to save me one, by the way. Next time I see you, I expect to have a smoked plum offering from you.
I actually didn't know that about the Jewish connection and the smoked plum. It's like very common in Lithuania. You never ask questions why, but you know how we use it actually, those plums? We stuff chicken. When we roast chicken, we stuff inside the cavity of the chicken, and then you carve the chicken and you have these plums which are cooked inside the chicken with a smoky flavor. Oh my goodness, it's to die for.
Well, whenever I go to Eastern Europe, I come back with smoked plums, and my favorite thing to do with them is I just like to make I always like, generally I used to put prunes in my making applesauce or things like that. I put a smoked plum now in the applesauce to eat with latkes on Hanukkah. And to me, it's like the best latke experience I could ever have. It's just like it's just like filled with this like it's slivovitz. It's just like smoked plum taste. There's nothing like it. You've never had it. But there's also all sorts of smoked fruits and vegetables. And actually, I just want to say a couple of other things. What I loved going to the markets and the outdoor or indoor-outdoor markets in Lithuania was seeing big tanks where there were carp. And of course, I grew up, and I spent a lot of time thinking about gefilte fish. I have a company called the Gefilteria, and I used to read this book as a kid, The Carp in the Bathtub. And so one of the things I loved was going and seeing in the markets these carp in tanks, like we have in the US lobster tanks. And people would take them home, and as I've learned, people still put them in their bathtubs, or many people have family stories of doing that to make what is essentially a gefilte fish for a Christmas meal, Nida, that you were speaking about. And the fact that it's still part of culture today, that thing that felt so uniquely Jewish in New York, in the New York area where I grew up, that was part of our story. This book takes place, in Brooklyn in the 1940s. These two kids fall in love with a fish, and it becomes their pet leading up to Passover. And the fact that everyone in Lithuania, most people in Lithuania, I would say, who maybe have Christian heritage, have the experience of keeping a carp in their tub, or some memory or some shared story. And it sort of brought home to me how connected these cultures were, in the past, and how, in some way, how sad it is that, how disconnected we are today. The fact that I didn't realize that this was part of a larger tradition, and in fact, we were connected. But of course, it was the Jews who were the carp traders and who were well known in the carp industry as well. So back to that, Jews as culinary transmitters. This was the role they played. And in Poland, they refer to the gefilte fish dish as Jewish-style carp. And Nida, what is it called in Lithuanian?
Actually, we do also gefilte fish, but we do it with another. Well, first of all, it's served only in the biggest holidays, like weddings, for instance. It's put on the center of the table. Usually, it's entire fish is done. It's not like balls, but someone knows how to take off the skin, how to put inside, and it has to be beautiful, nice entire fish with head, with tail, like a decoration. But of course, it's such a delicious food. But yes, I know exactly what you were talking about, this carp po żydowsku. It's a Jewish carp. Although I don't know if in Israel anyone would know that recipe, would associate it with Jewish food. I think it's just Polish invention because they thought that this is Jewish. I don't know. That's my sense. I'm not an expert and I'm not a historian, but yes.
I also want to reassure the participants, the viewers today, that the recipes that Nida and Jeffrey have shared with us on screen will be shared with you if you want to try to make them at home. And also, please do ask questions. There's going to be a Q&A segment coming right up, and we're going to spend a good amount of time talking to you and asking Jeffrey and Nida your pressing questions. So this is a joyous conversation, and also it's a very bittersweet one. And I wonder, Jeffrey, as you lead tours in Eastern Europe, I imagine there are people who come on the tours who are Americans who have Eastern European Jewish heritage, and they're trying to reconnect with not only, like what was lost, but what life was like. And I feel that's something that you really specialize in. I know that you like to try to recreate the details of life that have been lost because Eastern European Jewish life has really been drastically and tragically diminished. But I wonder, in your experiences, how do you kind of understand the role that Jewish culture plays now in countries where the Jewish communities have left such a big impression, culinary or otherwise, but the actual numbers are so small?
I mean, listen, it's a great question. It's a hard question. To be honest, the whole idea of a culinary heritage tour to Eastern Europe in some ways is, it seemed people never even thought of doing it, basically, because so much of the heritage tours to Eastern Europe are so focused on on you know, on the Holocaust and what was lost. And yet the reason I was interested in doing it was because in my travels to see Eastern Europe, my family all came from Poland, actually. We weren't Litvaks. And in fact, growing up, though, I knew that we weren't Litvak because anyone who was Litvak was so proud of their Litvak heritage, which was so deeply connected to intellectual curiosity. And I always felt a little bad about that. But that's an aside. But I went and I experienced a few things there that I think will help answer this question, Gabriella. But one of the things that I experienced was among, like Nida was describing, in Lithuania, when I went to Poland and visited where my family's from, I met people who were so interested in the Jewish story and the Jewish history. And they described to me what feels like you know, it's called, you know, sort of like a phantom leg, like the phantom, you know, the absence of the Jewish community is really felt. And I remember a cab driver who drove me to the town where my grandparents were born, who told me that, you know, bakeries had never been as good in Poland since the Jews disappeared, and that sort of shocked me. And out of that, it was difficult to hear because, you know, it's nice to have the Jewish legacy of bakeries be appreciated, and also, yes, it's you know. I wish you would say more about the absence of the Jewish life, I guess. Lithuania in particular, it's challenging and complicated to visit because it's a very tiny Jewish community that's left, and most of the Jewish community is actually Jews who came from the Soviet Union, not Jews who were living in Lithuania before the war. There is a smaller Lithuanian-Jewish community, and there's actually a split in the very tiny community. However, you can walk through the old town in Vilnius, and you can get a sense of what Jewish life looked like in these small, little, narrow corridors. What I'm so amazed about Vilna in particular, its history, because it was a cultural center. It was a thriving intellectual center. This was, of course, I mentioned, we talked about the Vilna Gaon and this tradition of Jewish religious scholarship and face down and studying, and this is sort of where you know, this is where I'd say it was there was the spiritual pushback to the Haskalah, to the Enlightenment, took place very much in Lithuania, and yet there was still this this secular intellectual Yiddish life. Lithuania, Vilna, was the capital of Yiddish. Yiddish language, the dialect from Lithuania, is considered to be the standard. And in fact, up until last year, there was still a summer Yiddish program at the university that you could travel around the world to go study Yiddish with elders who were from that old community. And unfortunately, last year, they couldn't get enough people together, and there was some politics as well. I also want to just, you're right, I don't love to recreate the past, Gabriella, but I'd like to look to it and have it inform how I want to celebrate and reimagine Jewish foods. I say that because it's not about preservation for me. It's more about understanding what was lost and how we can capture it. So for me, like the mushroom culture. Like, I wish I grew up foraging for mushrooms. I wish I learned that mushroom barley soup was so much better with good mushrooms and not button mushrooms from the supermarket. I also want to hold up a book here that tells a story that is not a story that I really knew about until this book. This is called the Vilna Vegetarian Cookbook, and it was actually a project that through YIVO, which is the organization of Jewish history that very much focuses on Yiddish history and culture, and actually started in Vilna in 1925, and it was basically anthropologists studying Yiddish culture as it was being experienced and as it was happening, and keeping amazing records which give us so much insight today into Jewish life in Eastern Europe, but also in the language and the Yiddish language. And of course now YIVO is based in New York City, and it's an amazing story of how they got their archive to New York. But this cookbook was written by a Jewish woman in Vilna named Fania Luando. And Fania had a restaurant, a vegetarian restaurant, you know, in the 1930s in Vilna. People like Marc Chagall would eat there. It was a celebrated place. And she wrote a Jewish cookbook that just, when I was researching Jewish food, I learned about I learned so much about how many vegetables were available. I remember getting into a debate with a survivor, a family friend, about whether or not there were leeks in Eastern Europe. And she grew up in the town of Dubienka in Poland. And she said, we never saw a leek. There weren't any leeks. And I opened up Fanny Lawando's book, and there were 7 or 8 leek recipes. I learned about this vegetarian movement that existed, and when meat was very expensive and it was hard to people weren't as successful or wealthy. There was actually a movement to eat and appreciate vegetarian lifestyle as sort of a way of taking agency over the expensiveness of meat and to make it part of an identity. And it's actually fitting because I grew up in a home. My grandmother was a vegetarian in New York, and there was a vegetarian hotel in the Catskills where my family used to go. And that vegetarian movement actually extended into North America as well. And that gave me a lot of insight to a nuance to Jewish life that, it wasn't just schmaltz and radishes. It wasn't just gefilte fish or what I actually, on my last trip for the first time, had a gefilte herring, which was a stuffed herring stuffed with Vorschmack and then baked. And it was a whole different kind of experience. And in fact, here was a Jewish woman who was an amazing symbol of progress. So for me, there's so much you can piece together, and yet to experience that loss, that phantom loss, that knowing presence of Jewishness, and you can hear sirens right behind me right now. I'm in New York, so it's hard to go visit, but I think it's important to go and taste. It's important to go and recognize that the flavors, something as simple as a pickle. This is like a fermented sour pickle. It's commonplace. So even called a Jewish pickle is almost insulting to the whole region because everyone eats pickles, And I'm going to eat one right now, but I actually felt much more connected to the land, and in seeing the seasons and being there, I realized how jarring the move from Europe to North America, from many people who grew up in the country or in a city with access to the country. And Vilnius is a small city. You can get to the country very easily. To go to New York City and be in this, dense urban jungle, where, yes, there were people raising geese in their backyards behind the tenements. There were people who had fish in their bathtubs. But this lifestyle was, it was really nearly impossible to keep. And the markets and the farms nearby weren't reflective of the kinds of fruits and vegetables available to Jews in the region. And so just by going and being there for different seasons and seeing soft fruit season, the gooseberries and the red currants, and being there in the fall on the mushroom harvest and the cabbage harvest, and being there through the winter, you get a different perspective on life in the region. So for me, that's been really helpful and really gratifying to kind of learn a bit more about where I come from.
All right. Thank you. You've both been marvelous, and I want to ask you more questions, but it's time for the viewers to ask some questions. So Julie Bayer and Batame Hertzbach have asked, what about tegelach? And what are the differences between American and Lithuanian tegelach? And I'm just going to warn you, after you all weigh in on tegelach, I'm also going to talk about tegelach because I grew up with Latvian tegelach. So Nida and Jeffrey, take it away.
If I may ask, when I was preparing my book, I cooked tegelach for the first time in my life. And it was so delicious that my husband couldn't stop eating them. I mean, I was asking him, please, I have to photograph it because it has to go to, the recipe has to go to my book. And he was so excited about this tegelach that in 10 minutes, he wanted to go downstairs to fix his bike. And the bike was fixed by a Sephardic Jew in Israel. And he said, well, you know what? I will make him so happy. I will bring him some tegelach. So he brings, a few tegelach, which I was begging him, to leave a little bit, at least for the picture. And he brings these tegelach to the Sephardic guy. He gives it to him and he says, just try it. The Sephardic guy, tries this tegelach and he doesn't understand why this man is so happy. He does not understand why what's it that's so exciting. So this is how I understood that perhaps it's in our blood. You know, it was the first time ever I cooked it, because, you know, as a child, I never tasted teglach in my life, but apparently we are born with that taste in ourselves, you know, that we taste it first time and we know that it's ours. When compared to Sephardic Jews, most probably they like gefilte fish. Give to Sephardic Jew to taste
Right.
gefilte fish.
No, thank you.
Nida,
Nida, can you describe the teglach that you made?
Yeah, I was just making the dough, and then I was cooking it in the syrup with honey, with the sugar, I remember, yes, and it has to cook until it gets a very, very dark reddish color, and it's sticky, it's wonderful, it's sweet, it's, oh my goodness, it's, you know, I cannot even sit nicely here while I'm thinking about teglach.
And what shape was the dough? How were you forming it?
I was told that you know, each household would have their own shapes how to make, but I was making like a knots. How do you call it?
Knot, yeah.
Knots, yes, like a tiny strips, and then I was making knots and I was cooking them, and they expanded and they were even nicer and more beautiful. Oh my gosh, that was amazing.
So Jeffrey, what is your experience with teglach?
I have never made teglach, and it's something that I did not grow up with, but I have eaten and tasted, and it's familiar, and like my experience going to Lithuania and eating a lot of, and in the Lithuanian community, by the way, they have the Jewish community now has what they call a bagel shop, where they have, and this woman Riva actually makes a lot of traditional Jewish dishes, and she made me teglach there, and it was lovely and beautiful, and a little bit and something that was a little bit unfamiliar to me, to be honest, as much as I've heard about it for so long. And Gabby, I know you have a teglach story, so but I will just say that teglach is one of those dishes that I feel like comes up a lot, because anyone with Litvak heritage or background, for them there's so much memory associated with it. And Nida, I was just curious, does anything like teglach exist in the non-Jewish Lithuanian world?
No, not that I know. For sure, that's particular Jewish. It's not Lithuanian for sure. That's I think one of those few dishes which were not adopted by Lithuanians. But I was very excited when I went to South Africa last time, about a year ago, and I brought teglach from South Africa to Lithuania to my husband, because he loves teglach. So I brought a package of South African Jewish Lithuanian teglach, and I'm sure, you know what, I'm sure those are the preserved teglach, the same. They have been made the same way as we or Jews used to make them 100 years ago. Because South African Jewish community is so homogeneous, Lithuanian Jewish community. They even marry in their families only Litvaks between themselves. So we call them blue blood. You know, it's the most Lithuanian community in the world. And if we Lithuanians would like to taste our own food, very, very traditional way, we have to travel all the way to Johannesburg to get that taste.
Fascinating.
I just want to, one second, there was a comment in that, Nida. It's very interesting because, you know, the that time capsule that is the Jewish community in South Africa, and also I would say well, it was in Zimbabwe. I actually studied at the University of Cape Town, and so I experienced that. It's so interesting because when in Lithuania today, there are a number of restaurants that are chefs searching for that Lithuanian past and heritage. But there have a lot of them are cooking the foods of the Grand Dukes and the foods of the nobility, which include foods. There's a lot of eel on the menu, and reindeer and other kinds of food that would in no way reflected. And so it's interesting. I'm curious, just when you say that the South African Jewish community, do you think it's the food of the that would be of sort of like for people who weren't part of the nobility, for the common person, that was a common meal, and that was what was reflective in the Jewish community there?
100%. I think this is the food from him, how they call it. It's like, their heritage food, they holiday food, the food which reminds them their Boba and Zayda, like those are the stories related to every single dish, and that's why they cherish that food. And this is why, we living in Lithuania, even though I think my grandmother used to cook totally differently. Even this cold borscht, which I made today, she used to cook totally differently. And when I tasted the cold borscht in South Africa, that's when I understood what my grandmother used to say. I mean, those guys in South Africa, they preserve food without changing, without improving it, because this is something they cherished, and they kept it in, and they still keep it for themselves. So to me, that was a lot of new tastes, I would say, bringing me backwards and learning my own history. And speaking about the restaurants, by the way, there is a new place in Lithuania, in Vilnius. As soon as you are able to travel, I'm sure I will take you there, which specifically wants to join that Lithuanian heritage with Jewish heritage. And these guys spent entire year researching, and they contacted me and asked me to share the recipes and knowledge, because they wanted specifically to introduce, you know, this farm to fork idea, and specifically to keep this not noble, not Middle Ages Lithuanian food, but the other part of our history, and in particular Jewish food, to introduce.
And one thing that was interesting at a few of those restaurants that are exploring that past is a life before potatoes. Because if anyone who goes to Lithuania will experience, honestly more potatoes eaten there than anywhere else in Eastern Europe. It's nuts. And I've even heard Lithuanians claim to have invented the potato ricer, which rices the potato. Whether or not that's true, who knows? You know, there's a lot of nationalism tied to food invention. I will say, when I went to Poland from Lithuania, and I talked to people, all the Polish Jews or people who were Polish, when I said kugel, everyone thought noodle kugel. Kugel's noodles, right? And when in Vilnius, in the Jewish community, or any Lithuanian you speak with, you say kugel, it's potato. What is noodles in kugel? That's crazy. You have to remember, these countries are next to one another, right? Like, you know, Lithuania is just a little bit north. They have coexisted for all these years, and yet no one had even heard of noodles in kugel in Lithuania. And that to me was so interesting. Especially because actually when I looked in this book, there's 2 chapters on kugels, which include, kugel is just like a casserole. You know, there's challah kugel, there's cauliflower kugel, there's
cabbage kugel, cabbage with cabbage.
Oh, cabbage kugel, yeah. Exactly. But it was so interesting that dichotomy, like there's noodle and there's potato, and of course, in Lithuania, it's all about the potato.
100%.
You actually anticipated a question from one of our viewers, Marcel, who said, talk about potato kugel, please. So thank you for being psychic. I'll quickly tell you my tegelach intel that I have, and then Jeffrey, go ahead and make your point, and then I'll ask another question from the audience. But the reason why I asked you, Nida, what shape your tegelach was is because I rarely have seen it anywhere outside of my family home. But when I have seen it, it's been in like kosher bakeries here in New York, very rarely. And it is little nuggets. So it actually looks more like Italian. I forgot what it's called in Italian. There's also an Italian dish. Forgot if it's struffole or stromboni. I might be completely messing it up, but it's probably some, you know, like evolution of medieval dessert that are like little boiled nuggets all piled up. And that's how I've seen tegelach here. But my grandmother made tegelach the way you were making them. She tied it in a knot and boiled it, and it was a beautiful little nugget, and it looked like amber. And yes, sometimes she would sprinkle some coconut on it. So it's actually very exciting, Nida. I think that we have tegelach in common also. But Jeffrey, did you want to add something about potato kugel?
Oh, I don't think I have much more to add to potato kugel beyond, you know, just the role of potatoes in Lithuania. You know, it's interesting. I think of kugel as a technique. A lot of these dishes that have been codified as potato kugel was a way of, you know, using, you know, whatever you have. You had leftover challah, you put it together, you mix it with eggs, you know, bake it into a casserole, and you make it, what was leftover challah or stale challah, into something special, right? And you could do that with various different dumplings. And what I appreciated about thinking about Frani Lawando and that Jewish restaurant, and she, you know, I don't know if she served kugel in her restaurant. We don't really have much information about what was served there, but we have the cookbook, and she literally made, you know, there was a rice kugel. There was a chapter on heavy kugels and lighter kugels. So just thinking about the role that kugel played in daily life, it was a quick way of having an important side, and it's interesting that that standardization that took place in America also has taken place in the memories of the Lithuanian-Jewish community. There's one way to make a gefilte fish, and anyone who knows, yes, we have this classic Lithuanian-Polish divide, but every town and village had its own style, and but now the Litvak style, it's often old-fashioned, it's stuffed the old-fashioned way, like Nida mentioned, and it's made with pepper, no sugar, but the pepper, when I had it made, traditionally it was made with these peppercorns in the stock when it was poached, but not actually ground pepper mixed in with the flesh of the fish. And so a lot of the memory of the community now has narrowed down to a few dishes. Tegelach is one of them, Imberlach is another one of them. And when I went to the bagel shop and bagels have made a resurgence in Lithuania right now, and they were a big feature of the Jewish community. When I went and ate in the bagel shop and ate some of these classic Lithuanian dishes in Vilnius, it felt like a bizarre world. It didn't feel at all like a Jewish deli because there wasn't that much of a Lithuanian contribution to the American Jewish deli, right? It was Romanian, it was Polish, it was Hungarian, and there wasn't as much of that Lithuanian influence. And I was served a matzo ball covered in powdered cinnamon and sugar, and and that was very unique. But it felt like I was eating things that felt so familiar, and there was so much herring, and yet they were just a little bit off, a little bit different from what I recognized.
Let's take a question from Kathy Martin. She said, "My grandfather was from Vilna, came to the U.S. around 1905. He used to make a cabbage soup with flanken and sour salt as some of the ingredients. I think he also may have put ginger snaps in the soup to thicken it. Does this sound familiar?"
Not to me, but I know that ginger snap is the ingredient which is made to chopped herring salad, by the way, which is made by South African Jews. And I believe that this is exactly Lithuanian because, like I say, those guys, they preserved very traditional, typical Lithuanian food. So ginger snap is one of the ingredients how you chop everything and you add it to make this consistency, the spreadable consistency. But I haven't heard of that, obviously, in Lithuania. And cabbage soup is I don't know, it's our blood, I'm sure, is made either of cabbage or of beetroot. I'm not sure which one. Summertime, it's a fresh cabbage. In wintertime, it's sour cabbage. It's like it's staple food. So yeah, I'm not surprised about cabbage soup at all, but I'm a little bit surprised about that ginger snap. Yeah.
Yeah, I've never heard about the ginger snap in there. I mean, it sounds like otherwise a classic cabbage soup. Some might call it even a cabbage borscht, depending on where in Eastern Europe people are from. And the ginger snap, it was to thicken the soup. Is that what you said, Gabby? What you read?
Well, the question has evaporated from the record.
Oh.
So my assumption is that it was to thicken, but I'm not sure if that was in the question itself.
Gotcha. Interesting. So I don't know that, but I definitely have, so many soups of the region use rye starter for making rye bread to thicken soups and to give it body, and even rye bread that was, hydrated in some flavor, brine or in water. So I'm not surprised. And, and if you're going to add some sweetness into your soup, the ginger snap and a little bit of ginger flavor, it's a great way to do it.
We have a question. Oh, sorry, Nida, go ahead.
No, it's okay.
You want to try it? Is that what you said?
I will definitely try it next time I cook cabbage soup. I will try it.
Well, it sounds delicious because it's like earthy, but also there's some acidity because she also mentioned the sour salt and then the sweetness. It sounds delicious. Leah Selterman asks, we talk a lot about how disconnected from our food heritage we are today, the underlying assumption being that past generations were more deeply rooted to land and tradition. How accurate is that perception? Of course, climate, seasonality, etc., had a larger impact. It was impossible to escape those physical realities. But did people really understand their food history itself better, or are we assuming too much in our nostalgia?
Listen, that's a great question. It's a hard one to answer for so many reasons because I can't speak to all the whole Lithuanian-Jewish community before the war. I can look to my grandmother as an example, okay? And I don't think she was aware of the history of her foods, but she's someone who lived in a town, had a plum tree, had an apple tree, had a cow, and her stories of how she ate they were matter of fact. She wasn't aware necessarily of the systems and she just that were in place, or she wasn't even sure of when why things were done, but she knew that every summer her mother boiled down the plums to make a plum jam, and on a copper kettle on an open fire, and when they had a cow for a brief period of time, but when they did, they had all this fresh cream and all this milk, and her husband, my now late grandfather, he grew up in Warsaw, and he didn't have those same memories, and he didn't talk about the connection to the land because he grew up in more of a city, and he trained for the Olympics, and he lived a much more modern life. His father owned a taxi company, and he knew how to fix cars, and so this was the exact same time. These were the 20s and 30s, and my grandmother lived in a small village, and went foraging for mushrooms and learned those things. And my grandfather was living a more modern life, and so I think there's a lot of nuance and complexity. And that said, I think what is clear. And Nida, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. I can speak to my experience growing up in the United States as a Ashkenazi Jew in the U.S. I didn't learn anything about the seasons. I didn't even think. I knew we ate apples on Rosh Hashanah. I didn't connect that to apple harvest, to picking apples. I was in some ways taught at the Jewish deli that it was always pastrami season. It was always rye bread, pastrami, pickles all year round. And I think if the Jews in Lithuania likely were living in pre-refrigeration, had root cellars. So it wasn't that I wouldn't say they were more aware of all these forces, but if they wanted to have sauerkraut in the winter, they had to either buy a barrel of sauerkraut or shred it themselves and ferment it and have it on hand. And that was just part of life. And so I don't think we need to romanticize it. There was a lot of hunger and pain, especially among the Jews of Lithuania. There's an amazing memoir by Hersh Abramovich called Profiles of a Lost World, where he describes how families who couldn't even have couldn't buy wheat flour to make challah for Shabbat, and so their neighbors would step up and help out. And if you had rye bread, it was embarrassing to have rye bread if you couldn't afford wheat. And that was and poverty was a part of life too, and not the only part. There's plenty of middle class and plenty of affluent Jews as well. So I just think we need to embrace the nuance and the complexity of pre-war Jewish life. And yet I think we can say Lithuanian culture today is much more deeply connected to the seasons. Lithuanians grow up. And Nida, correct me if I'm wrong, you know that there's good mushrooms available this time of year, and to go to the market. The cabbages will be juicier and sweeter if you eat them in the fall than if you eat them in the summer. These things because that's just part of how that's just the culture.
You made a very good point. First of all, saying that Lithuania is a very small country, and we think Vilnius is a huge city. It's 600,000 people, but of course, when you compare it to New York, it's a tiny little city. So as you can imagine, it's very easy when living in Lithuania. It's very easy to be still connected to the land, because the land is 20 minutes away from where you live in the biggest city of Lithuania. So seasonality was always part of our lives. I'm sure 100 years ago there were totally different reasons why people had to follow the seasons, because obviously they didn't have refrigerators, they didn't have any other things, but nowadays I think we are getting back to seasonality, to local food, to this farm to fork. We want to know where our food grew, and in Lithuania it's very easy to do so because the environment we live, we grow is very ecological, very green. Jeffrey, you of course you notice how green Lithuania is, how many trees, how many, almost every second or third person has own piece of land somewhere as a summer house. It's like this is part of us, and I'm sure it was part of also Jewish community. This is why it's so close to the land. And speaking about foraging, national sport of Lithuania is mushroom hunting. When the mushroom season comes, it's a national sport, literally. Entire Facebook is full of pictures. How many boletos have you gotten, these days? So everyone carries extra shoes in the trunk of the car, because maybe, you will have 2 hours and maybe you will escape to the forest to get some mushrooms, some chanterelles or boletos. And this year was crazy. I don't know what happened, but this was simply, I have no idea how many years we will be eating mushrooms which we collected this year. I have no idea why we've got, maybe because of Corona, I don't know, but we were awarded very graciously by the nature with mushrooms. So we will not have to go to the mushroom for at least 3 years, because we have a lot, dried and pickled and all sorts of mushrooms. And we know how to do this. And always people knew how to do this, because we live very close to the nature.
Please send us some mushrooms.
Oh yeah, they are dried, so they can, they can stay for a couple of years.
We have a question for Nida from Adrian Murphy. Would it surprise most Lithuanians, as it did for you previously, that there is such a connection between Jewish and Lithuanian foods?
I think, if I understand correctly, the question is about what dishes are surprising for Lithuanians, that they are in fact Jewish dishes, right?
That is one way to interpret it. I think the question was, would it surprise other Lithuanians? But if you want to elaborate with what dishes would be surprising, that would also be very interesting.
Yes, I think, when you I will perhaps tell you one story which would partially answer that question. About 2, 3, 4 maybe years ago, there was a very young couple from New York coming to serve in the American embassy here in Lithuania. These guys, very young couple, husband and wife, but young kids, they were obviously, this was their first assignment, and for very understandable reasons, the families were pretty much worried to allow their children to go to the other part of the world. And Jewish mothers, what they worry about, what their poor kids will be eating in that unknown part of the world. So I spoke with these guys, maybe couple of weeks after their arrival to Lithuania, and it was so funny, and it actually answers partially the question. This girl, she says, my mother nearly cried when I was leaving from New York to Lithuania, because they had to look carefully to the map to find where this Lithuania is. And after 2 weeks, this girl, she says, what, I'm calling to my mother and I'm saying, what, I feel in Lithuania, I feel crazy. I feel like it's a Jewish holiday every single year, because there are Jewish holiday dishes every single day. We have latkes, we have honey cakes, we have apple cakes, we have blintzes, we have cold borscht, we have hot borscht, we have all Jewish foods, which we usually attribute to certain holidays, and we eat only on holidays. These Lithuanians, they are very strange. They eat it every single day. So I feel here excellent, because I am celebrating every single day Jewish holidays. So you see, it's so much our food. For instance, latkes, right? Latkes is very much a dish of Hanukkah for Jews, right? In Lithuania, latkes can be eaten, I don't know, every single day perhaps. And if you go to the restaurant, especially when the fresh potato season is, you for sure would get latkes every single day. Every single day. The same as kugel, the same as any other very typical, very, very basic Lithuanian foods. So to many Lithuanian people, to suddenly think of the idea that latkes is Jewish, they would perhaps, they would for sure, they would not want to agree at least 5 minutes, first 5 minutes that this is Jewish food. They would say, no, 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 that's for sure 100% Lithuania. And there are so many things like klopps, like a meatloaf, right? It was a food which was given to me when I was in the kindergarten, and suddenly I go to Israel and I'm given the same food, and they claim that this is Jewish. It's like, to me that was, you know, that was surprise. I couldn't, you know, to me it was really amazing things to learn. The same gefilte fish, kugel, and basically, by the way, speaking about kugel, my mother used to make kugel in the way of Jewish understanding of kugel. I mean the lakshan kugel with noodles, right? So when we had leftover noodles, my mother used to use the leftovers. She would make this. We would not call it kugel for sure, because kugel was potato kugel, but we had this dish. And after 15 years, I went to Israel and I learned that this particular dish is called kugel in Mea Shearim in Jerusalem. So you see, I think there is every single dish except perhaps pork and all you know, non-kosher dishes. Eaten in Lithuania, I think every single dish has a certain relationship with the Jewish culture, with Jewish culinary, and the Jewish traditions.
Fascinating. I still wonder how much of it belongs to one group or the other, but we can have another follow-up conversation about that. The next talk, we will talk about that some more. We'll have time for one more question before we wrap it up. Why is our gefilte fish so different? We took the meat out and left the skin and bones. I imagine that this question is asking, why do we have these, you know, like little, you know, cutlets? I'm assuming we as us in this country, the US, while in Lithuania, you're stuffing back into the skin, and maybe enlighten me a little bit. I'm trying to extrapolate. There's a few missing components of this question that I would like you to help me figure out. How is Lithuanian gefilte fish made?
I can only guess, because I heard that those are the stories which were shared with me in Israel. I've heard that, you know, Jews used to make gefilte fish on every Shabbat dinner, or nearly every Shabbat dinner. So, you know, to make this entire fish, it's a lot of work. I think Lithuanians, when they would make gefilte fish, they would make on very, very special events. And those events would be like a wedding where you invite 100 people. For Lithuanians, it's a huge wedding, 100 people. And then you want to show up and you make that entire whole fish, you know, to demonstrate the you know, the special occasion for that dish. So I think it's just to make your life easier. The taste, I'm sure, is very, very similar. Although I must admit, my personal taste, I love that Polish way of gefilte fish, the sweet versus Lithuanian sour and peppery. My choice is definitely Polish, the sweet one. must have something maybe Polish in my blood.
And just to answer the question about why, how we got to be these, you know, blobs of fish in a jar. I mean, a lot of that was, you know, for one, and even in Europe, outside of Lithuania, you know, it just became easier to not have to clean out a fish and then stuff it back in and then bake. You know, it was beautiful, this spread, but it became easier just to do this quote unquote stuffing. And this actually is a style of cooking fishes, and the French use it as well to make the fish, you know, quenelles, and so it just, that was a style that kind of grew and came to with, you know, many of the immigrants to the United States, and in the Jewish community, it was modernizing, and as the food system was industrializing, we saw the gefilte fish get stuffed into a jar. In fact, there was a patent for making jarred gefilte fish filed in the early 1960s, and this became what we now think of as gefilte fish. Most people who aren't very connected to their Jewish heritage may only have ever tasted jarred gefilte fish, and it also became the butt of jokes. However, you can go to Argentina and they actually they bake their gefilte fish. You go to the UK and they fry their gefilte fish. There's different strategies and different techniques. And as you've talked about, Nida, these foods have traveled with different communities all around the world. And then you go to South Africa, they're stuffing their gefilte fish. And so in the US, a lot of Jewish food in general just got standardized. It got boring, and we lost the people stopped making the foods, and they started getting them from the shop. And for many, my family was Polish. Most of the Jews who came to the United States came either from Poland or from the Pale of Settlement. Before there was Poland, the modern Poland. So a lot of the, if you were Lithuanian, you were likely buying food from the deli or from the fishmonger that was made by someone with a different background and heritage to you. And so a lot of those distinctions were lost.
Before we ask you the final question, by we, I mean me and all of the lovely people who've joined us today, I just want to thank the Vilna Shul once more, and the Lithuanian Culture Institute and Consulate General of Lithuania in New York for inviting us today. And Jeffrey and Nida, before I ask you the last question, I want to thank you both so much for your generosity and for the beautiful things that you made us. And I hope that we can do this again in person sometime and eat together. Thank you so very much. And we're going to send you off with a final question. Please shamelessly plug your cookbooks and where to get them. And that's from both of you. And also, Jeffrey, tell us about your culinary tours, and Nida, tell us which website we can catch your latest blogging at.
I don't know, Jeffrey, you will start off, or I should start?
I'm happy to go first, and you can go after.
Okay.
This is my cookbook, the Gefilte Manifesto. You can get it at most places where books are sold, especially online. Some of the online book retailers. My favorite now is bookshop.org, which supports local bookstores. You can go and find out more about me and my company, the Gefilteria, at gefilteria.com. And in fact, you can follow us at Gefilteria on Instagram and Twitter. And for more information on the heritage tours, you can go to Taube, Taube, JewishHeritageTours.com. I can write it into the chat. And right now, we don't have our tour rescheduled. The most recent one was supposed to leave in August, but we, of course, could not go. And hopefully, there'll be another tour soon. But you can find out about all tours, including that one, at that site. And I'll put it in the chat.
Before I will show my book cover, I would like to do one very important thing. When I saw this, I immediately understood that it must belong to Jeffrey, because this gefilte fish painting, nicely painted, painting, I will definitely send it to you, because you must have it. It comes from Vilna, it comes from the bottom of the heart, and some unknown author was very trying hard to express, that taste in this painting. So it belongs to you, and it will travel to you. Another thing which I also would like to send you together, because it's a shame to send half of the empty box. These are the fridge magnets produced in South Africa, with tiny blocks with various Yiddish words, where you can get every day different sentences on your fridge, and on one hand to learn Yiddish language, and on the other hand, well, to remind yourself of, for instance, der Mensch tracht und Gott lacht. So that will go also to you. And one more thing, also, my friends from South Africa created this amazing initiative, which is named Lita Lives. Lita Lives, and they started this amazing idea that Lita for Lithuania, obviously, although it's so far away from South Africa and from New York, it still lives in your hearts. It still lives in our food, which we share. It still lives in everything, in our culinary traditions, and may it live also as a kippah with South African patterns inside. There are few colors, very, very much South Africans, and it's written Lita lives. So it will go as well to you. And now I would like to show my book, which is A Taste of Israel. Unfortunately, it's sold out, so it's the only thing which I can show is the cover, which was available a couple of years ago. The book is also translated. It's the Lithuanian version, the same, but also it's translated to Polish version, which is totally of different cover. So basically, the original is that one.
All right. Wow.
Beautiful.
Nida, thank
Wonderful.
you so much. I'm so excited.
Great job, both of you.
Thank you everyone for joining us on behalf of the Consulate General of Lithuania in New York and the Vilna Show. We are very thankful and grateful you joined us this afternoon for this fabulous, fabulous discussion. As Gabriella mentioned, we will be sending out all of the recipes via email, as well as answers to some of the questions we weren't able to get to, specifically about plums. There was lots of questions, and Jeff, maybe you want to talk just briefly for 1 second about where you can get these delicious plums that you spoke of, because people are already Googling and trying to find them and they can't. And we'll send out links to both Jeff and Nida's books. Nida's is available via electronic is what I've been told, but not hard copy, as well as her food blog. So Jeff, one final last thought on plums and then we will say goodbye.
I will say I've gone on this plum search. It's not easy. Even Brighton Beach near me, the big Russian Soviet community, former Soviet Union, various different people of different backgrounds, I could not find these plums. What I recommend is you can, if you have a smoker, or you can set up a little stovetop smoke situation, which is a lot of chefs do in their kitchens and home cooks in Lithuania. And you can literally just like put some prunes you can buy in the store, and you can create the flavor yourself, which I would recommend. Or next time you go to Eastern Europe, bring them back. I bring back so many, and it is since I haven't been able to go in a while, I'm running out. But bring them back. You will thank me.
We have to establish the plum import-export business, I guess.
Yes. Yes. Or a new product for Gefilteria to make, Jeffrey.
Wonderful. Thank you everyone for joining us. And we wanted to do a quick cheers.
L'chaim to everyone.
L'chaim. Cheers. Thank you for joining us, everyone.
Cheers.